So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce Richard and his work. And I just wanted to say, one of the reasons why I wanted to invite him is because there are very few scholars out there whose work combines the components that his does, in particular, sort of traditional philological, like hardcore, deep in the data kind of work, sophisticated quantitative methods, and linguistic theory. And I think one of the reasons why his research is so successful and so interesting is because of the ways that he weaves these three threads together. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think we're all very much looking forward to your talk or lecture or however this should be billed. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. That's a very nice introduction. So yeah, welcome. You can just call me Richard, and I'm a lecturer in English language and linguistics here at the University of Manchester. And yeah, it's very, very nice to meet you all. I'm quite excited. And I really appreciate the opportunity to give a guest lecture here today. I hope we'll spend a stimulating and fun lesson together. And yeah, thank you again, David, for inviting me. I have a lot to say. I have a lot of ideas and thoughts, and I enjoy talking. I love linguistics and language change, but I wasn't really sure what sort of topics you guys would profit from the most. And so I decided I would like this lesson to be quite interactive and include some discussion and questions, perhaps. And then depending on your input and interests that I hear from you, I will try to be a bit nimble, perhaps, and share my most relevant thoughts or whatever you're interested in. And I will try to pick and choose from different materials that I have and improvise a bit. So please be very courageous, be confident, have fun with it. There are no wrong answers, and just contribute whatever you want and whenever you think you have something relevant to say. So let me maybe share my slides here. Great. So I decided to talk about the why question of language change. What causes grammars to change? It's a perfect question, an ideal question for discussion, because I believe nobody really knows. The why question of language change has also been called the holy grail of language change. Why? How do we explain syntactic innovations? What triggers changes in grammar? Triggers is another common word that you see in the literature. And this is very, very important. When you read articles on syntactic changes, you will see they devote a lot of space to talk about why a syntactic change occurred. Now, this is a broad question and it doesn't really have a correct answer. Also, it's not very scientific. People say you shouldn't ask why questions in science, you should ask how questions. Don't ask why is the sky blue, ask what makes the sky blue, because otherwise you run into an infinite regress. So you get one sort of answer for a why question, but then you can ask, well, why did that happen? And then why did that happen? And so on. So it's sort of an arbitrary intuitive point where you say, this is satisfactory. This constitutes a sufficient explanation for me. But despite this, people in historical syntax ask this why question all the time. It is intuitively plausible. And so that's what we will try to talk about during this lesson. Yeah, so I have an exercise here, exercise 1. I will give you 1 minute to think about this question for yourselves. Why do you think languages change? There's no wrong, right answer. Just the very first thing that comes to your mind, that's already good enough. Don't think it's silly. It's interesting to think if this is the first time you think about it, the first thing that came to your mind. But if it isn't the first time you think about this question, perhaps you already have some very specific ideas in mind. At any rate, I will collect what you have to say and then perhaps use your information or your ideas to structure the talk a little bit. Okay, so let me maybe share the document where we can collect the ideas. All right, okay, let's see. As I said, don't be shy, just throw at me whatever came to mind, okay? Eliza, would you like to start?
Yes, the first thing that came to mind is that the environment changes. So the situation where speakers find themselves speaking.
Can you maybe explain a bit more what you mean by environment changes? What is it in the environment that changes? For example, or maybe Just give me another word.
Oh, yes. Everything that is extra linguistic, not, yes, external to the linguistic system itself.
Like, for instance, culture, society?
Yes, I'd say so.
Okay, very good. Yeah. That is a very common, I think, first approach. You think about new technologies, for instance, that then necessitates new words. When there was no internet, we didn't need a word for internet. Now we have the internet, so we have a word for it and it changed. Yeah, I think that's a very common, that's a good first approach, I think. Klaus, what came to your mind?
I was thinking like more on like a smaller scale, just like the process of language acquisition. It doesn't like give you an exact copy. There's going to be some way that something gets reanalyzed or gets acquired differently from how it was transmitted.
Okay, so something like reanalysis, for instance, could happen in child learners when they acquire language. Okay, so let me maybe say children as the drivers of change. Would that be something you agree with? Is that what you meant?
Yeah, like not like the only driver, but definitely a big driver, I think.
Right. Very nice. Yeah, certainly people in psycholinguistics, language acquisitionists, have also talked a lot about language change. Now, me personally, that's not something I work on. So unfortunately, I know very little about this, but perhaps I have some thoughts I can share about this towards the end as well. Let's see, Tom, how about you?
I was also thinking about the medium of language. So the goals of poetry versus texting might cause different shifts in how language is used that could then move into just regular speaking or writing even.
Right, okay. I would say something like poetry, novels, textbooks, that's maybe more like a genre. Whereas texting or reading or hearing things, that's a medium. So both could be linked in some way to change, but how? Do you have another idea about this? So you're saying if I have a new medium like texting,
yeah, I think like
this will necessitate some changes.
I think texting, at least in my experience, brevity is kind of the goal. So you're trying to really smash down language as much as you can. And that may then lead to how you actually speak, like people saying LOL when they're speaking now, which I don't think they would have before texting so much.
Yeah. So this is how a genre could come in. So from writing to speech. It is quite unusual. Not a lot of people have thought about this, but it is true. We say things like LOL or slash. Do you use slash? It's a great example of how writing can find its way into speaking in the grammar too, because slash is very much used like a conjunction. Good, yeah, great ideas, very nice. Let me also ask David maybe. Of course, you must have thought about this a lot. So if you could only give one idea, what would it be?
I mean, yeah, if I had to just narrow it down, my guess would, I'm actually inclined to go with what Klaus said and to identify like acquisition, or rather that is where a lot of imperfect replication or imperfect transmission takes place. Oh, well, maybe I'll just mention one more that occurs to me in connection with a project that I've been working on recently. And that is, there was an anthropologist who coined this very peculiar term called schismogenesis. And it's not used in linguistics a lot, but it sometimes does show up in studies of dialect formation. And the idea is that speakers of populations of speakers will deliberately start to speak differently to set themselves apart from other groups within a population. And so I don't know what exactly we would call that, like linguistic identity, like assertion of linguistic identity
Yes.
leads to a new dialect or to a new sociolect that then becomes recognized as a language over time. Yeah,
Yes.
something like that, perhaps.
Yeah, very good. I think this is also a common kind of explanation. Maybe we could say this is some sort of social explanation or a conscious social, consciously social explanation of sorts. Yeah, and several people have tried to come up with explanations like this. Fits right into this list. Very nice. Simone, I don't know, if you want, you can say something.
Yeah, sure. I would say language internal factors. So when you have language change because, for instance, there is a loss of grammatical functions that need to be replaced somehow, and that may trigger kind of a chain reaction, but does not really solve why language changes in the first place. But I mean,
yeah, very
it would
nice.
be
Okay.
phonological erosion or something along those lines.
Yeah, this is another very big factor that a lot of linguists have commented on and try to find some sort of explanation that appeals to efficiency, replacement, chains, economy. Also a very common one, and maybe I will talk about this as well. Very good. You come back later to this and maybe think about some of those points a bit more. So the problem with this question is that, as you've just noticed, approaches, answers, and convictions differ widely. Oftentimes, these debates can also be a bit heated. So there is some ideology, there is some bickering. What I will do is give you some perspectives, also try to respond to your ideas. And I would very much encourage you to just be creative with this question, think outside of the box, and come up with new ideas. Nothing in this area of the why question and diachronic syntax is standardized. There's so many different approaches and ideas, but one common distinction is that between language internal and external motivations. If you open a textbook on language change, that is something that you will see in most of them. So to some degree, that is standardized. But even this fundamental distinction is controversial. I think different authors mean very different things by language internal and language external. Here's one quote from Hickey 2010. Internal change is that which occurs within a speech community, generally among monolingual speakers, and external change is that which is induced by contact with speakers of another language. But here's a very different definition from Young 2001. Language change is explained when its causal forces are identified and their interaction are made clear. At least two components are essential. An iterative process can be stated in terms of Chomsky's distinction between E-language and I-language. That is a very common idea that there's a difference between usage and knowledge, a difference between, say, knowing how to drive a car and actually driving a car. So I have a grammar in my head, but I also externalize it. And you can see that this E and this I here corresponds very nicely to external and internal. So the idea is your parents have an internalized grammar or a mental grammar or whatever the representation in your mind is. Let's call this I language. Then they speak to their children, they create an E language, children pick it up, create a new I language, but create a different kind of output. You repeat this process over and over and language will change. So this is a very formalistic interpretation, and Young also casts it within the context of universal grammar. So that's UG here. He says the internal knowledge of universal grammar determines the space of languages that learners can attain, and the external linguistic experience in the environment determines what language children do attain. So this combines formal notions with the distinction between internal and external changes plus formalistic syntax universal grammar. So I think this is quite different. My understanding of internal versus external motivations is more or less this. A language internal explanation focuses on an aspect within the language system. So this is based on a syntactic theory, for instance, weakening of inflectional endings, also very much like what Simone said, you lose a grammatical item, so maybe you want to replace it. Language external explanations, here the focus lies on aspects outside of the language. For instance, the Norman invasion of 1066. Immigration, or new technologies like texting, for instance, like I think Tom mentioned. My opinion is, and that's just an opinion, you don't have to agree with this at all, that language external explanations aren't really good explanations. I don't find them satisfactory. If somebody tells me, okay, this form exists because of language borrowing, I still want to know, well, how exactly did that happen? Once it enters your mental representation of language, how does it interact with the network of other constructions or words? How does it act within the system? So what I want to do first is give you some examples of language internal motivations for change. Maybe this makes this concept clearer, and maybe those are also some very interesting case studies of syntactic changes. Okay. So here's my first example, the loss of verb movement. Maybe let me just see, do you guys have any understanding of this term? Have you heard verb movement, loss of verb movement before? Eliza, can you go like this? So, yeah. Ish.
Yes, we
Okay.
we talked about V2 movement in German in
Okay.
class. So yes.
Okay, good. Right. Okay, good. So I tried here to come up with an explanation that's as theory neutral as possible, which isn't always easy, but perhaps you find this easier. And then I give you a more standard formal notation. So in English, in the history of English, you can measure a number of constructions of the type, first a finite verb and then something else, an X. And you will find this is replaced with the structure X and then a finite verb. This X element here marks the boundary between your finite verb and a domain that hosts central elements of a clause, most importantly, the main verb. So this would be in periphrastic expressions like is going or has done, objects, but also secondary arguments. I don't know, for instance, causatives. I made my teacher happy. Happy would also be inside of this element, which linguists most commonly call the verb phrase. And so then this X that separates your finite verb and the verb phrase might be, for instance, frequency adverbs, often, sometimes, never, negations, or not, floating quantifiers, and other things. It's called the loss of verb movement because this phenomenon was first described in transformational grammar, where movement is assumed. And I just use this name, but I don't use it in a theoretical sense at this point. So in English, as an abstraction, we will see that in Old and Middle English, you saw structures such as he came never, which now sounds quite odd. I indicate here the verb phrase, and the metaphor would be that you take the finite verb came, raise it outside, out of the verb phrase, and move it in front of the adverb. In modern English, this verb movement, the arrow here is lost. And so now we say he never came with never before came. So finite verb X changes to X finite verb. In theoretical terms, the movement operation is usually said to target T, and T stands for tense. I illustrate this here with the trees in 2. Mary reads sometimes a book. This would have been an Old English or a Middle English structure, where we take the verb, which I indicate here with the T, which stands for trace, and move it into this head, which is called T for tense. Another common label you find here is I for inflection. Now we lose this verb movement, and we also only get Mary sometimes reads a book, with read staying in the verb phrase. So that's the phenomenon I'm talking about. Here's a natural example. He remembered after words of Helia the prophet, That's from 1400, around 1400. And first you have the finite verb remembered, then the adverb often. As opposed to 3b, he oftentimes appeared to his disciples. That's a bit later, 1480. And here we first have the adverb and then the finite verb. I hope that makes sense. The transitional period for this change, I would say, is roughly 1400 to 1650. Here I show you some quantitative measurements. The clearest measurement is obtained with the adverb never. That's the solid black line here. So by 1400, most examples would have been of this kind here. He came never. But by about 1650, most examples are of the innovative type. He never came. So that's this black line here. You can actually measure this change very nicely in corpora. Okay, so let me just check here. Does that make sense to you guys? If you have a question, so far so good.
Okay. I have a question.
Yeah.
In the graph, what is SV, the HLY?
HLI refers to specific kinds of adverbs, those early ones that end in LY. But it's not really important. There are different ways of measuring this change, depending on what you identify as the element X. But the general trend is the same for all of them. So finite verb X changes to X finite verb. Here's also the reference. It's a great paper. I like it a lot. And you can find out more about how this change was measured there. Great. Okay, so let's move to the critical question here. Why did this change happen? I'm not saying any of these explanations are correct or even good, but it's indubitable that, in fact, this has been a productive and fruitful answer. A lot of people have talked about this. There's a rich literature on this, and that is the explanation called the Rich Agreement Hypothesis, or RAH. Here are a couple of references. But there is a large literature on this. The idea is that verb movement from V to T is lost because inflectional endings on T or on ice or on tense or on inflection are also lost. So when inflections disappear, then this triggers the loss of V to T movement. That's the idea here. You lose certain inflectional morphology endings, and then that also triggers the syntactic change. That alone is pretty exciting because it's such a strong, such a powerful claim. There are, of course, problems. How exactly do we have this link between a morphological head in a tree and the syntactic operation? The details are sort of missing. You need to spell out how exactly that link is supposed to work. One question that has been discussed a lot is what counts as sufficiently weak inflectional endings. Obviously, you can always innovate and change your inflections. When do your endings become quote unquote weak enough to trigger the loss of verb movement? There are specific answers to these problems, but there's so much on it that I can't really go into detail. I'll just give you one example. For instance, here is a definition of the Rich Agreement Hypothesis. Morphological deflection, so the loss of endings, should trigger the loss of V to I movement, meaning only if language learners are confronted with particular morphological contrasts do they postulate the presence of corresponding formal features that in turn drive syntactic operations. So that attempts to spell out that link between morphology and syntax in greater detail. And here's an idea for what counts as weak inflectional endings. Language has V to I raising if and only if, in at least one number of 1/10 of the regular verb paradigms, the person features first and second are both distinctively marked. That's a concrete idea that can be used to maybe test the Rich Agreement Hypothesis. So you go to any of your tenses, present tense or past tense, then check for a first person, for instance, I come versus second person you come, and see if the verb is marked distinctively. If it isn't, then this language will not have verb V to T movement. And as it so happens in English, in fact, we do see a loss of the relevant inflectional marking. So there used to be a distinction in English, and maybe you know this, maybe you talked about this, between I drink or I drinke and thu drinkst, with this ST ending, or thou drinkst. Maybe you know Shakespeare, thou art. So there's a specific ending for the second person singular pronoun. This second person singular form got lost. Now there is no difference between singular and plural. It's you for singular and you for plural. And lo and behold, at around the same time, we also lose V to T movement. So English itself is perhaps the strongest empirical claim for the correctness of the Rich Agreement Hypothesis. However, in my estimation, the Rich Agreement Hypothesis cannot at all be regarded as uncontroversial now or standard. It has mostly met with skepticism. But as I said, as far as these things go, this is quite popular. There is a lot of literature on this particular topic. So first of all, it is a very strong claim. It's amazingly detailed in a way. You lose this morphological ending here, and then you will lose this particular word order pattern. So this is a strong claim, which requires a strong burden of proof. So naturally, sort of as a good scientist, as a good linguist, you need to remain skeptical until you really have a lot of evidence for such a strong claim. Also, this actually assumes movement as a crucial part of the explanation. So if you look at this tree again, you could think of this movement arrow as just a metaphor to deal with dependencies that are far apart. But in this case, it's actually more. It's assumed to have a certain reality in your mind. It's part of sort of the ontology of syntax. So if you subscribe to a grammar framework where there is no movement, you're automatically biased against it. So I myself, for instance, do not formalize my syntax in minimalism or in Chomsky and transformational grammar. I prefer other frameworks. So that's also maybe a disadvantage. And as it turns out, scholars have been very pessimistic in their writing. Some have claimed that it is just false. So we disproved it. But there's always sort of post hoc rationalization for certain explanations. You can weaken your premises. It's not so clear how you can disprove it, what exactly would count as counter evidence. And for me, this is really more typical rhetoric, sort of an attack and defense discourse that is just typical in a scientific debate. Some people say we've proved it, some we've disproved it, and over time, perhaps enough evidence will be accumulated. It has also been criticized as being too simplistic, because as you can see here, this is a great example of a language internal explanation. You only need to look into the syntactic system. You see one internal change 1, that then triggers an internal change 2. But that means it ignores everything else. It ignores things like language acquisition or, children as a major driver of change, pragmatics and semantics. Maybe you're more inclined to like computational linguistics or frequency distributions or n-grams, or sort of a mathematical list. This is also not part of the explanation. And some people have even argued that you cannot show in principle if the RAH is true or false. And if this is the case, if you cannot test a hypothesis, it is unscientific. So in order for a hypothesis to be scientific, it has to be able to be false, at least in principle. If this is not the case, this would actually be a pseudoscientific hypothesis. And the RH has also been accused of that. So the reason why I mentioned it, though, is because it is such a good example. It is almost deterministic. It's almost like a law in physics. And I think that's why it has such strong appeal in linguistics, why it has been so productive. Okay, let me see. Oh, perfect. I just was going to ask for questions. There's one. Yeah, go ahead.
So I just had a quick empirical question. Can we at least be certain that the loss of inflection preceded the word order change, or could it actually have been the other way around?
Yeah, it is a very difficult measurement to make. So I've got the best data here. And the best data for the replacement of thou with you, I mean, it happens at around the same time, maybe a bit more slowly. So the thou maybe dies out by 1700, I would say. Although right now I can't think of the best fact. So there is this Rummelin-Brunberg book on many syntactic changes at that time. For instance, they discussed the replacement of ye with you, because first you need to get a you for nominative and for accusative. And then this you also extends to the second person singular. So this is also part of the story. It could start at around the same time, but then it's a bit slower. And you only need to start the change that is supposed to trigger the next change. It doesn't actually have to go to completion before the change it is supposed to have caused, I believe. So it's a very, very difficult question. It's a real empirical challenge to see which one really happened earlier, because even just the first attestation is so idiosyncratic and based on such a small amount of texts that it makes a real difference. If somebody discovered a new you that was used instead of thou in 1300, maybe that's possible, that could completely change our picture of what happened here. So I don't think but this is just one example of many, many open questions for the rich agreement hypothesis. So I would just answer more research is needed. Yeah, great question. Yeah, that should probably be somebody should look into that. Somebody should double check that this particular change here, the loss of endings like thou drinkst or just thou in general, happened earlier than the loss of word movement. But then somebody might just come back and say, well, it's not really this contrast. Actually, for inflections to count as weak, something else has to be lost too. So I guess the argument is broader. It says English in general lost a lot of its verbal inflections. not just, maybe this is not the one relevant contrast. So you can just repair your hypothesis and point to another inflectional ending that is supposed to have triggered the loss of word movement instead.
Right.
This, I guess, then goes to this third point here. Well, if you can always repair your hypothesis, will you ever admit you're wrong? So, yeah. I have prepared a second example. If you guys want, I'll talk you through a second example of an internal change, which I also like, which I think is interesting. And this one is called the loss of local anchoring. It's entirely based on this paper here, Lowe's 2009. It's my summary. I hope I don't do her injustice, but it's a great example, I think, of another typical explanation that is language internal. So here is the phenomenon. Local anchoring describes a information structural function of a clause initial position. That's the first salient position in a clause, which is usually modeled as the specifier of CP. The specifier of CP in early English tended to be used to refer back to earlier material. It was used for textual cohesion. So an example is shown in 4. There's a Bible quote that precedes the sentence. It says something like, I myself am the beginning who speaks to you. That's a direct Bible quote. And then this author says that Moses also had something about this Bible quote. So it starts with Betham, which is, Old English about that dative, wrote Moses. And then the author goes on to say what Moses wrote about this Bible quote. So here's our context. Here is the earlier material. And this initial specified position refers back to it and creates a link. It's almost an anaphoric relationship that this position tended to have. So here are a couple of quotes from the paper. For discourse, reference, and text cohesion, that's the main function of the specifier of CP. Textual cohesion as the primary function of the first constituent. Discourse functions of the first constituent. It encodes unmarked topics, topics being all things, anaphoric things, given things, things that have been mentioned before. And it has a lack of prominence. There are a couple of grammatical markers of this, such as grammaticalized are pronouns. Are pronouns are adverbs like here or there or where plus any prepositions. It is very productive in English. You can take any preposition and put it under any of these adverbs. So I don't know, where plus about, or there plus in. So hereby, therefore, wherein. These elements create cohesion, and these elements are frequently found in the initial position. Also demonstratives like that, this, those. And of course, in Old English, those used to be case marked, like in this example here, Betham. And finally, you also find deictic adverbs in this position with a very high frequency, like then, thus, there. So they're pointing to things in the world and in discourse. Let me give you a couple of examples. They're difficult examples, but hopefully we'll get through them. And some of them are difficult to understand, I think. Maybe you have some ideas about them too. So in 5a is an example from 1390, a famous text called Merck's Festial. Thus Jesus showed himself both as true God and true man. He was a true God in that he turned water into wine. So that's a miracle. He turns water into wine. And he was a true man in that he ate and drank with him. And then here's the relevant sentence. This miracle he did in showing that he blesseth the wedding. So this miracle is not the subject. It's another element in clause initial position. It has this demonstrative in it, and it refers back to the immediately preceding context. So probably this, turning water into wine, this miracle, but maybe even the entire structure here, turning water into wine and also drinking and eating with them. I mean, who wouldn't like to drink and eat with God? So this miracle and then something else. Here's another one. This is from Mallory. Sir, said a knight, me thinketh your shield is no good. I will lend you a bigger one. So you have a small shield, you need a bigger shield. I will lend you a bigger one. And then you get this sentence. Thereof, I pray you. Pretty cool, I think. This thereof must refer back to lending you a shield. So it's kind of difficult to translate this. Here's my attempt. I would translate this as, please accept it. Or rather, it means something like, please accept me lending you a bigger shield. It's incredibly polite, I think, when you think about it. Can anybody think of a better translation? It's nobody says it like this anymore in modern English, right? But can you think of a good translation of thereof I pray you? Oh, I mean, I think my translation is all right. Here's the last example, a poem. She is fair and she is free, and so hende as she may be, there takene, she is well with me, that shall I full well show thee, thee being to you. So that I shall show to you, that referring back, I think, to all of this. I shall show you how fair and beautiful she is, and that I treat her well. All of this I will now show you with the that in initial position. Okay, in contrast, in modern English, the initial position, so specifier CP, is very different. It is quite rare. It's not often that we front things in English, in modern English. And it is crucially not really used for linking anymore, according to Lowe's. Rather, you find it for very salient discourse functions like contrast. It conveys greater informational prominence. For instance, marked topics or marked focus, and it is generally pragmatically marked. Here's an example. You could have a context such as, I hate hamburgers, but pizza I like. That, I think, is a relatively natural use of fronting to the specifier of CP in modern English, and it creates a contrast. So this is a focal structure, not hamburgers, but pizzas. It creates this distinction. So let's assume that this is correct. We use this local anchoring of this kind, where you have textual cohesion markers in the initial position, and we get a different kind where the specifier of CP is used for pragmatically marked situations. What sorts of consequences does this predict? And here Lowe says this difference, this change, can lead to a number of interesting syntactic consequences. First of all, topical subjects become much more prevalent in the history of English. The reason is that the function of specifier CP as an unmarked discourse linker was taken over by the subject. So now subjects are the unmarked discourse linkers. I tried to illustrate this in 9. So here's the sentence again. I myself am the beginning who speaks to you. About that wrote Moses. Of course, you can't say it like this in modern English anymore. So I'm wondering, how would you express that thought in modern English? Well, I could use the subject perhaps and try to use a word here like this or that or the other thing and refer back to the context. So maybe you could translate this as, I myself am the beginning who speaks to you. This thing, this saying was described by Moses, or this was commented on by Moses, or something like this. So the subject now is supposed to be more topical than it used to be. Second consequence, and directly linked to this, is that passives should increase. When you have to use subjects for old information, sort of now you're required to link back to context via the subject, you need to make your subject more flexible. And one way to change the theta roles or the semantic interpretation of the subject is to passivize it. So you can use passives to promote information that is structurally relevant and topical. And indeed, we see a lot of interesting new passives in the history of English that had not always existed. For instance, prepositional passives. The doctor was sent for. That did not exist in Old English. That's an innovation. Also, we have ECM passives, where you raise an accusative subject after certain verbs like say or assume or hear or think. So for instance, 9, Canadians in Britain, such as Oscar Peterson, Garfield Weston, Paul Anka, many of them are generally assumed to be Americans. The active of this would be, I generally assume many of them to be Americans. So that's what this underscore here indicates. And you raise the subject of this passive out of this embedded ECM clause. That's another example of a passive that didn't exist in the history of English. And it has become so productive that there are now some ECM passives that don't even have an active analog. Like in 10, John was said to be lying. That's okay. But the active of this, she said John to be lying, is actually ungrammatical. So those are some very interesting facts, I think. I think those are cool sentences. And they could be linked to the loss of local anchoring. Another consequence is, or might be, the subjects now occur in English with very rare, very unusual semantic interpretations or theta roles. So English subjects can occur with virtually every theta role. Loos calls this the rise of quite unusual subject strategies. I think that's what she means by this. Typical theta roles for subjects are, for instance, agents. Mary painted her table, okay, or experiences. Mary loves Tom, or themes. The sun is shining. But English also has cross-linguistically rare theta roles for subjects. For instance, time. 2004 saw deep budget cuts. That's a good sentence. Or places. This tent sleeps 5. Or even sources like my bucket leaks water. Yeah, maybe you can ask yourselves, if you speak a language other than English, if you can translate the sentences in 12b and c directly into your language, chances are that you cannot. So English is quite unusual in that it allows sentences like this sentence sleeps 5, my bucket leaks water. Yeah, some people think English is sort of a vanilla language, not very exotic, but English has its cross-linguistically rare structures like these prepositional passives or like these unusual theta roles for subjects. The last fourth consequence that Loos mentions is an increase in it clefts. The idea is that it clefts in English are also pragmatically marked structures. So now if you really want to focalize something, you would use an it cleft. It was John who came to the party, either contrasts it, John, not somebody else, or makes it salient, or puts it into an exhaustive list, or something like this. It focalizes John. And since we lose one information structural strategy, maybe that's the reason why we innovate others. And Loos has this little experiment in her paper on the translation from Dutch, which has a verb second pattern, into English. And Dutch translators sometimes make mistakes such as this. They translate a Dutch sentence like, with pleasure, can we inform you, literally as a prepositional phrase fronted sentence in English. With great pleasure, we can inform you that you have been accepted for the job. And I hope you'll agree this sentence is actually a bit odd. You wouldn't really say it like this, perhaps. But this is a good strategy for an it cleft. It is with great pleasure that we can inform you that you have been accepted for the job. This is probably how you would express the verb second structure in Dutch, as far as these things go, if you can translate something. And that shows you that this it cleft and the fronting perhaps may occupy or take similar functions. Okay, so this would be my second example. So let me just ask you, we have this claim that the weakening of local anchoring more or less has directly caused subject properties in modern English. What do you think? Convincing? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Do you say, yeah, that makes sense to me, I buy it? Or would you say, no, I'm skeptical, I don't believe it? Thumbs down for Klaus. Okay, thank you.
A 45-degree angle, like half down, half
All right,
up.
okay, good, yeah. Good, why? Yeah, what makes you skeptical? So let me see if I can scroll down a bit here. Criticize the ideas. What's wrong with this sort of approach to the why question of change?
So like it's not so much like about this specific approach. It's just like we don't have like the larger context, like more examples or like cross-linguistic patterns or something like that, where like I feel like this like isn't enough to draw a conclusion from.
Okay, yeah, I agree. Yeah. And I mean, you're going directly to cross-linguistic patterns or other completely different sorts of evidence. Well, I agree. I mean, we need much more evidence to really believe it. But what about the evidence that was presented?
Like the way it was presented, like I find it plausible. I think it's just like the evidence itself is what's lacking. Like
yeah, exactly. Not even just going to cross-linguistic evidence or psycholinguistic experiments or something like this, completely kinds of evidence, even just evidence for those claims from the history of English, provide some counts, something concrete. Yeah, so you want to derive from this an actual testable hypothesis, not even necessarily with numbers, although I like numbers, I like to have some quantitative evidence, but something else that you would predict that isn't already in your explanation. Yeah, so that's kind of my biggest problem here. So there is no quantitative data from corpora, and it's not clear what sort of statistically testable hypothesis we could even derive from this idea to make it testable. And there are many other problems. We could go into this in some detail if you find it interesting. But I also like, Klaus, that you said that you do find it stimulating, that you do like this idea. It is very similar, I think, to the first example, the rich agreement hypothesis, in that you have this almost mechanistic idea, right? So you lose this, and as a consequence, all of the other things in the system change. I don't know if you agree, but this is what makes it appealing. It gives it this law-like character, this internal explanation that seems like a real explanation in some way, if it was true. And also, I think the other thing that I find interesting about this is that it sort of turns the why question around, doesn't it? It says, okay, here's one change, and it derives a number of consequences from it, rather than saying, here is an effect or a change, what caused it. Do you know what I mean? Maybe this is not a bad strategy because it makes it more creative, more productive. It's easier to see, okay, here's one change, what could cause it, and think about changes that definitely did happen or happened at a later time, and just say, well, maybe they are linked. The problem with this thinking, though, is you are very likely, I believe, to overgenerate and link all kinds of changes to this one change because you really want to make a point. Oh yeah, this could have something to do with it, and that could also have something to do with it. And before you know it, you arrive at all these things. So that's this question here, I think. For instance, if I asked you, how would you explain the increase in it clefts in the history of English? This too can be very clearly measured. If you look for structures, it is X, who, or that did something, you see a very nice increase in the relative frequency of these structures over the course of English. And I asked you, how would you explain it? I think it is very unlikely that your first intuition would be, oh, that has something to do with information structural properties that you used to have in the initial position of English. That only happens after the fact. So now that we know that this is the original explanation, quote unquote, we want to link it. But if you didn't come from this perspective and you just started with this change, you would never think about this. And in fact, it seems a bit outlandish to me. It's not so clear to me that this initial link, the initial position, is really the same as an it cleft. An it cleft has its own history. It has its own uses, its own function. It is very different, probably, from how Old English functioned. It does not really occupy the same functional niche, in a sense, or the same pragmatic structures. It could just be a whole independent, new, unrelated development. And that should be your default position, I believe. It's a more sensible position. So using this approach is more creative. It is also less scientific, I think, and more problematic. That would be my opinion. This is really the point that I wanted to get across, I think. Language internal explanations are very common in historical syntax. You find them in a lot of papers. They feel good. They feel plausible. They feel like real explanations, satisfactory explanations. And then finally, they are not really tested. They have this problem, this empirical problem, that you don't really know if this was the cause or not. Those would be my take-home messages from this. Another thing I wanted to mention here maybe is some of my own work. In 2020, I published a paper that I quite like, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have published it, that I guess is my most mature thinking about why languages change up to that point. I'm not saying I have any answers at all. Nobody has any answers. But if you ask me, well, what are your ideas? Why do you think languages change? That would probably be the best paper to go to, or at least the one where I try to articulate my insights and my ideas. Let me give you a couple of quotes here. So one thing that I believe is that this idea that we can have law-like explanations, like in physics, here's a cause, it leads to this effect, should be given up. It's a bit dangerous. I think historical developments must be understood as contingent rather than deterministic. So the moment you say or make a claim like this change will automatically lead to this change, I think it's wrong. It always depends. Yeah, isn't that what people say? It depends. So many other things could interfere with a development like this, that even if it's a tendency, it has to be at least probabilistic. And then you have to think about all the interfering factors that could happen there. So if somebody tells me I have this law, if you lose inflections, then you lose verb movement, I don't like it. I think it's too simplistic. I rather think there's a crisscrossing network of many interrelated influencing factors, and those can be grammatical, they can be cognitive, general functional mechanisms, they can be sociological, like picking consciously a form that you find appealing for your identity, and all kinds of other historical conditions like texting. All of those are sort of relevant in this network of cause and effect. But then you could say, well, can you ever test anything? I don't know. I mean, maybe you can answer that question for you at the end. The why question of language change, does it even make sense? Does anybody know anything? Well, I'm optimistic. I hope that even though these interfering factors are so complex that you cannot really allow the identification of a necessary and sufficient cause, so one that will always and necessarily lead to an effect, that does not necessarily mean that you cannot test any causal associations. Maybe you can think about this network, identify certain bits and pieces, and try to come up with a hypothesis to test this smaller point. Maybe you can isolate a specific potential causal influence on a linguistic innovation and attempt to derive empirically falsifiable predictions targeting this causal relation between the two dimensions. This is very, very, very difficult. And in fact, as we just seen in Lowe's 2009, people don't always do it. So this very difficult task of testing some of your predictions is often simply omitted. So I thought, hey, at least I tried. So in this paper, I have a change, and then I tried to derive from this an explanation for it that you can actually test a little bit, perhaps. So if you're interested in this, shameless plug, you can go to my homepage here. It's just my name, richardzimmermann.com. And maybe if you find what I have to say interesting, check out what I publish or whatever. Okay, so you guys at the beginning already said, so many good points. I hope I could maybe link some of them to internal ideas. I list some other perspectives here that I try to sort of anticipate from what you said. So let's see again. So for instance, Eliza first mentioned external cultural, societal, environmental changes, and that is a very common idea. And also the social explanation. So let me maybe go here. So I have prepared this little bullet point here. What would I say about the idea that languages change as a consequence of sort of a social act, societal use, an identification of a variable that you like, and so you want to speak like this. The best idea, the most radical idea of this sort, I think, is in this book, Croft 2002. I have it here. Yeah, explaining language change. So I thought that sounds like a good book. But I don't really like what he has to say. I think it's too radical. I think it's too simplistic. He says the variance in a linguistic variable. So you know what that means, right? So I don't know, you have two ways of expressing the same thing. I help to do it, or I help do it, or verb object versus object verb order. So some variant of a variable. These variants, these forms, these items have social values associated with them. That's quite a rich sentence already when you think about it. So you have a representation of a linguistic item, and associated with this representation is some social value, whatever that is. And then speakers select variants to use, that is to replicate in particular utterances on the basis of their social values, overt and covert prestige. That's a very common concept in sociolinguistics. Have you guys taken a course on sociolinguistics? No. If you did, this is a very basic, very common concept. You have forms that are appealing, you want to speak like them, and you have covert prestige for bondedness, male bonding, for instance. They use all kinds of slangy terms and try to be cool. That creates prestige for your group cohesion. Overt prestige, that's when you want to speak posh and formal. And so you select these forms depending on how you need them for your situation. Linguistic selection is governed largely, if not exclusively, by social forces that have little or nothing to do with functional adaptiveness for communication. So it goes against some other explanation, obviously a functional explanation. And I think that is closest to the very last point we mentioned that David brought up. And that is that there could be economy considerations change. Oh no, Simone brought that up, I think. I can't remember, but economy, chains, shortening thing, being more efficient. That would be sort of a functional adaptiveness. And he says, well, that explains nothing about language change, but social values, that's the one explanation. So again, it's too exclusive for me. And also I really struggle. I mean, maybe it makes sense in sound changes where you say, okay, particular vowel, that sounds uneducated, that sounds stupid, that sounds dialectal, versus the standard form, that sounds interesting and educated and posh. But how does the examples that I mentioned, the loss of local anchoring, or saying he came never versus he never came, how does that have social values? So if I gave you syntactic changes that are going on right now, for instance, with help to do something. So in help to do something, the to is dropping out. In fact, your generation has a better than 90% probability of leaving the to out. So I don't know, can you say, I don't know, America helped to provide food rations to that country? You're probably more likely to say America helped provide food rations, but this to is dropping out. Does this variation really correspond to social values for you? Or when verb movement was lost, or the loss of social local anchoring. So you have an initial position and you link it back to the discourse, the text discourse. Does that really correlate with whatever this social value according to overt and covert prestige is? It doesn't really work in syntax. I think it works fine for smaller unit like sound changes and maybe individual words. Say, for instance, the change between very and really. It's very good, that sounds a bit posher. It's really good, that sounds a bit more familiar. Okay, maybe for individual words. But for syntax, I find it very difficult. So I don't really buy it. I think this conscious picking of social variables for identity reasons is not really something I like. There's another very famous reference for this sort of idea, and it's this one, Keller 1994. Anybody familiar with it? It's for this sort of idea, it's a famous reference. And it basically says, young people drive change due to wanting to be different. And there are two conflicting maxims similar to Grice's maxims in Pragmatica. On the Grice's maxims in Pragmatics. On the one hand, you want to fit in. You want to be a part of your group. You want to talk like the others talk. And so you have this idea, talk in a way that you are accepted. So if you're with your friends, you accommodate, you want to speak like them. And also, maybe you're just lazy. Why do you need to always innovate and be special? Just talk like everybody else around you. On the other hand, you want to be special. You want to be noticed. You want to be creative. You want to be yourself. You want to be an individual. You want to be unique, right? So you have this maxim that says talk in an amusing way, in a charming way, in a funny way, in a unique way. And those two maxims conflict. And children, or at least young speakers, are very much driven by this maxim. They want to find themselves or be themselves. And so that's why they use particular forms that then in the next generation hang on and thus cause change. Yeah, I mean, I gave you my opinion. That's not really the kind of explanation I want or that I find plausible, but it is out there and it is quite popular. Also, recently, we went for a drink with our department, a couple of people, and I asked this question, why do you think languages change? And one of my colleagues stated almost matter-of-factly, languages change for the same reason that fashion changes, or haircuts change, or clothes change, right? It's sort of, you pick and choose so that you are special or you fit in. You know, so there are people out there who are convinced that this is the right explanation. I don't know, do you guys want to tell me what you think about it? Do you buy it? Do you think, yeah, you know what, actually, this is the sort of explanation that I would find appealing?
I think that this works perfectly with pragmatics. Everything that is, yes, pragmatic, like thank you, or please. So pragmatic words fit in this description, I think. But
that's very interesting. Yeah, maybe you're onto something. Maybe I was wrong when I said that, you know, that these two go together, because this, I think, is very much for phonology and individual words. Maybe this kind of reasoning is actually for units larger than syntax. So pragmatic utterances, politeness, thank you, or how you greet each other. And maybe if there are changes in that system, you could directly correlate it with some way to test this idea that it's driven by these maximums. So maybe it doesn't work for syntax, but for pragmatics. It hadn't occurred to me before. Thank you. Yeah, it's a good thought. Yeah, clever. Maybe. Let's see. I have so much to say. Maybe what could be relevant for you too? Which of you is the Indo-Europeanist? One here is from Indo-Europeans. You, okay. Do you know about the wave theory? Ish. So, you know, you either have a tree, you know, Indo-European with 10 branches, or you think about it more like a wave. Yeah, does that make sense? So I think that's maybe interesting for change, because you could think about it as languages having a core. Yeah, and from this core, the innovations tend to spread. Sometimes they peter out, so they don't go to all the dialect continua, and that's how you create new dialects over time. I think what that means is that the geographical core area of a language should be the most active. It should be like active and bubbly, and it innovates all the time, and then it radiates out. And maybe this is actually something we can see. So for instance, in English, there's much greater dialectal variation in England than in the other English-speaking countries. Or in America, there's greater dialectal variation on the East Coast than the West Coast, depending on, you know, where it radiates out. And I think, I don't know, maybe for Romance, that's true too. I have a map here. Maybe let me show you that map. It's very hard to judge. I don't know, you be the judge of it. But though this is a good map of recognized Romance dialects that are sort of equally dissimilar from each other. And you could perhaps imagine that the greatest density of dialects is in Italy. And Italy, of course, is the homeland of Latin. So from Italy, you get the radiation out into the other Romance-speaking countries. So I think that's maybe interesting for change, the idea that you can actually correlate it with geography. So if I only had a map and the density of languages, maybe I could predict from this where the language comes from. And in fact, people have tried this with phoneme size. I don't know if you know this study. It was quite famous because it was published in Science, which is great. Linguists don't usually publish in Science or Nature, the world's most famous science articles, but people in this paper correlated the number of phonemes with the distance from Africa. And it turns out there's a weak effect. The further away you go from Africa, the smaller your phoneme sets become. So Khoisan languages, you know, with clicks and all this have hundreds of phonemes, whereas Hawaiian, for instance, only has 5 vowels. So this idea that you radiate out and you lose a certain structural complexity, in this case, you know, on the scale of millennia, is really interesting, I think. And maybe for someone studying the relatedness between languages on a really large scale, even just in the European, of course, maybe goes back, what, 5,000-6,000 years, perhaps, maybe just 4,000 years, who knows. But it's an interesting link, perhaps. So I thought I'd mention that as well. Yeah, I think I go to this point here. Yeah, I think this is also a good take-home message for you guys. I believe that when you ask someone the why question of change, you immediately get their own biases out more than any real answer, because I told you, I don't think anybody really has any answers. So, if, for instance, you already like a formal semantic explanation, then this is likely where you go to. If you're a mathematician, then you probably explain it through mathematical modeling. If you're a psycholinguist, you probably want to talk about language acquisition in child learners. There are so many inspirations, so many links between the why question of change and all kinds of other disciplines. It's really hard to keep track, but I list a couple here. Biological evolution, that's a big one. And that's actually one I like. I think we can learn perhaps from biology something about the why question in linguistics. Also, economic theory has been used, even climate change modeling. You know, the idea is perhaps competence and performance are a bit like climate and weather. Complex systems, population dynamics, game theory, and famously even chaos theory. It's above my head, but it's a very complicated theory in mathematics that was used, for instance, by Lightfoot, who is a famous historical linguist as well. So what I would like you to do is go back to your answer for question 1 and think about this for a second. Why did you give this answer? What might have been your bias? Where are you coming from? Why did you pick that sort of answer that you picked? What I want you to do is sort of realize, okay, I'm not a blank slate either. Everybody's coming from somewhere. Simone, do you want to get us started? Why did you say, language internal factors?
Well, because I mean, my interest is syntax, of course, in synchrony. So I suppose there is a bias there. And then I think, I mean, it's self-explanatory.
Yes, I wasn't even surprised you said it. If you had asked me, what is Simone going to answer? I thought, oh, he's probably going in this direction.
Right, in that direction, yeah.
Eliza, you went to external factors, technology and texting.
Yes, because I had the chance to study research about cognitive metaphors.
All right. Okay.
So yes, and yes, I think that's what triggered my answer.
Have you talked about grammaticalization in this connection? Grammaticalization is a big topic, I think.
Oh, well, yes. In general, I studied grammaticalization, but in that context, it was more well, grammaticalization didn't fit in that specific context, but
yeah, I was just thinking it because I think metaphorical explanations work quite well for grammaticalization changes. So that is a good link. Let's see, Klaus, child acquisition, psycholinguistics. How come?
Yeah, I think that's like just like the one that I've also been exposed to the most.
Have you? Okay.
As opposed to bias, like that actually is like my least favorite explanation because like
really? Okay.
I like really don't like psycholinguistics. Like nothing against the field. I just like it's like I want to stay very far away from it.
Yeah. It is very different.
Yeah.
Let me see. I think what I take away the most from psycholinguistic literature would be the fact, I think it's a fact, that children simplify. Children do not like in the middle probabilities. They like 0 or 1, yes or no. So when children are exposed to variation, they tend to simplify it. If every generation successively simplifies variation, you ultimately go from one form to the other, and perhaps in sort of an S-shaped curve that we frequently observe. So this is a very important connection maybe. And I also know of, I think, one paper. Let me see if I can find it really quickly. I don't know if that helps, but the paper is by, I think, Westergaard and Kemenade, I think. Here. Yeah, it's one of those. They look at the loss of verb second. I'm sure you sort of have an understanding. So like German or Dutch, the verb is always in second position. And they look at the information structure. This is the one part, historical change. And they link it, I don't know if it's this paper exactly, they link it to child acquisition data from Norwegian of all languages. And this is, in fact, I think the only paper that I know that brings together language acquisition and diachronic syntax in the traditional sense, in the sense of, let's look at Old English or Middle English. Yeah, but I agree with you. I also think that language acquisition, psycholinguistics, is very far away. It's so different, powerful. I mean, it's probably, I also like the idea that children are the major drivers of change, the innovators, those that carry the innovations into the next generation. Some people vehemently deny it. My belief is that there's probably a lot of truth to it, but working on it, being a psycholinguist, no, it's just so different and full of weird methodologies that I don't like. And the answers also are not very attractive. So I fully understand what you mean. Yeah, and Tom, let me think again. You went to different mediums, right? The writing versus texting, or how you go from writing to speech, or from speech to writing. What do you have an idea what triggered that sort of thought?
I think part of it is with a classics background. I'm very text focused and genre focused, thinking about differences between poetry and oratory and history, those types of genres, and then trying to think about a language I know well enough to think about why change is happening, and that's English for me. So then I see change most frequently in texting, probably. So I think that's how I ended up there, but
yeah. No, I think it's a great thought. Unfortunately, I may have even less to say about this one than about language acquisition. Other than genre is an extremely important topic. So when you read papers in historical syntax, genre comes up a lot. Nobody really knows how to handle it. So maybe, who knows, maybe in the future you will have something relevant to say about it. It is a big topic. It is unresolved. There's a lot of question marks. I guess my idea would be, once you have a lot of genres, say 40 different genres, which might be relevant maybe from 1500 on in the transmission of English texts, you could have statistical model where it's simply a random effect. And you can sort of estimate how much variation between genres is normal. And that way you could say, okay, here's a general change, but depending on where I look for my data, I might expect this much variation, which could then perhaps help us identify a certainty interval or something like, okay, here's my point estimate, but it could also be this or that much more or less frequent. It is a good topic, and who knows, maybe you can work on it. And David, I mean, for you, it's probably very difficult because you might have a lot of ideas and thoughts in your head already. So which one to pick? But maybe in this moment, in that situation, what it was that made you say what you said.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you that I have my own set of biases and that I bring to the research that I do. My answer was motivated by the fact that I've been working on a project on the history of the Greek dialects. And this is a situation in which the dialects start off and they continue to look very similar, but certain dialects underwent changes that others did not. And so it's given that they have very similar starting circumstances, it's hard to see functional motivations or internal changes are harder to, internally motivated triggers. They seem harder to find in a situation like this. And so what people have typically said is that this is socially motivated change, that, there were some dialects in some parts of the world, or some parts of the Greek-speaking world, that wanted to distinguish themselves from others. So that's why my answer was connected to a very particular project and data set.
Brilliant answer. I mean, you can see directly how one thought leads to the next, and you're not really fully responsible for that thought. You can't really fully be sure that it's true because we all have this particular background. Yeah, brilliant. Very good.
I know we're quickly running out of time, but I was wondering if I could ask you one methodological question that goes back to the Los 2009 paper.
Yeah, sure. Okay, if this is the right.
So one of the things that I struggle with in my own work, and that I know has been an issue, at least for some linguists who work primarily on English, is the fact that our Old English dialects are by and large in the West Saxon dialect. But Middle English and later stages of English come from something in the Southeast Midlands area. I don't know enough to know anything more specific than that. But my question is just, how do you think we should handle this kind of discontinuity? That is, that strictly speaking, what we can observe in Old English texts is not really the direct ancestor of, say, Middle English and Middle English and early modern English. Do we just say, well, that's technically true, but probably the strict ancestor, the direct ancestor of Middle English was probably close enough to the Old English that we can observe that it's probably okay? Anyhow, I just wanted to get your thoughts on this discontinuity question.
Well, I guess the methodological answer that people do in fact use is we just try to use it anyway and make the most of it. I think that also reminds me of the thing you just said before, where we don't really have enough evidence for internal change. So the best we can perhaps do is resort to a direct contact or social explanation. And so let's try and do this. Same with the continuity problem. We have our West Saxon texts. That's all we have. So the best we can do in a way is use those texts. Of course, the data is extremely bad. So the low quality data needs you to always formulate all of your conclusions in a very open-ended, vague, uncertain way. Otherwise, you're just doing a disservice to what the data allows you to conclude. I have found, so from about 1400 on, we have enough data to actually conduct full-scale dialectal studies. There is the Linguistic Atlas of late Middle English and Linguistic Atlas of early Middle English. From that time on, I think the problem is much smaller, but then you get new problems, statistical problems or methodological problems. Once you have a lot of different dialects, how do you actually include all of those then? Just because suddenly you have the data doesn't, well, maybe it makes this one problem go away in that now we have a direct ancestor for the language that we have now, but now it creates a whole new set of methodological problems. So one thing that I thought might be useful is to simplify the problem and break it down into two variables. For instance, Northern versus Southern English. That ignores a huge amount of variation and dialectal detail that dialectologists would be very interested in. But as a first step, maybe I can break it down into a binary variable and then say, okay, here's the Northern texts that behave like this and the Southern texts that behave like that. And I can estimate to some degree how big this problem is. There's a possibility that it's not a problem at all. And it doesn't really matter which ancestor language you pick. They are all so equidistant from each other that you can track the change or the ancestors in this one attested form as well as if it was the direct ancestor. That's unlikely, but it is possible. And perhaps by breaking it down in this binary way, that would be a first step, a methodological step to improve that situation. It is a huge problem. Nobody has a good answer, and there can't be an answer. The only answer would be to actually have more texts that we just don't have. So it's not solvable, but perhaps this is a step into an improved situation. Should I just read out about the biases that I wanted to finish with? One quote that I quite like from my dissertation. I'm a huge fan of the Romans. I like everything Roman, the religion, the architecture, how everything worked, having slavery in your everyday life. And I also like the collapse. It's a huge question in history. Basically, why did the Roman Empire collapse? And I think it's very similar, perhaps, to questions we would ask in linguistics. So I'll just read this out to you. Perhaps you like it. Explanations often seem to be advocated from a particular relatively subjective vantage point. This seems to be a characteristic partially shared with history as an academic discipline. For instance, when one looks for answers to the question, why did the Roman Empire collapse? One will find that every answer is influenced by individual convictions and concerns, by the spirit of the age. In the early 20th century, after the beginning repeals of anti-miscegenation laws, the fall of Rome was seen as a consequence of race mixing. In the 1980s, during a time when the Iran-Contra affair revealed massive corruption in the Reagan administration, Rome's collapse was attributed to the corrupt, morally bankrupt nature of her officials. In the 2000s, at a time of multiculturalism, globalization, and refugee crises, the decline of the Roman Empire has been connected to mass migrations and the loss of cultural identity. Similarly, answers to the why question of language change can be expected to be fundamentally different if they are given by a usage-based functionalist who wants to eliminate the need for a language-specific mental grammar, or by a generative formalist who wants to attribute variation to minimally different parameters on an otherwise invariant universal grammar, or by a traditional philologist who wants to connect text to their manuscript witnesses and external history. So yeah, I've seen some ideological bickering, arguing. Sometimes it can be vitriol, it can be quite aggressive. So here are some recommendations, I think, how you should deal with the overwhelming fragmentation of the field of linguistics. Try to stay open-minded and just be creative with it. Try to come up with, you hear something crazy you disagree with, maybe you can come up with something even crazier. Another thing that I would say is try to measure something. Don't be like Lowe's 2009, get actual text, the corpus, and try to have some operationalization of something that at least will give you something concrete and you won't go crazy. Don't be dogmatic. You know, if you formulate something, just be very cautious. Allow for uncertainty. Acknowledge that there is bias and that there are alternative answers. And also, finally, perhaps this is a good advice. Do not get married to your explanation. Sometimes you are so vested into your own ideas that it's very difficult for you to give them up. So treat your hypotheses like a date, not like a marriage. I remember many, many years ago, I listened to this documentary by Richard Dawkins, who is an educator, but also a biologist. And he expressed a sentiment that had influenced me. So I thought maybe we can listen to this very short clip and, you know, have an end point that way. It is basically a story about trying to stay open-minded and the scientific ideal. And I kind of like the idea that I heard it, influenced me, and now shared with other people, and maybe it will influence them. Okay, so let me just see if I can share this. 1 second. So my final advice for you about staying open-minded.
I do remember one formative influence in my undergraduate life. There was an elderly professor in my department who had been passionately keen on a particular theory for, a number of years. And one day an American visiting researcher came and he completely and utterly disproved our old man's hypothesis. The old man strode to the front, shook his hand and said, "My dear fellow, I wish to thank you. I have been wrong these 15 years. And we all clapped our hands raw. That was the scientific ideal of somebody who had a lot invested, a lifetime almost invested into theory. And he was rejoicing that he had been shown wrong and that scientific truth had been advanced.
All right. Well, I hope that sort of corresponds to your scientific ideal as well. Maybe that's a good point to stop. Maybe I say one last thing, and that is the reading that I sent around. In this situation where everything is possible, every explanation is a possible explanation, apart from the advice to stay open-minded and kind and friendly and not give in to this ideology, my next step would maybe be philosophy. Because philosophy sort of goes to the very fundamental points, you know, like what should I do in ethics, or what can I know? You know, I am, I think, therefore I am. So the most fundamental things. So what are the most fundamental things that we can actually know about the why question of change? That's just maybe my approach. You could go into any of these many, many directions. They're all fruitful and they're all exciting. But I sent some reading around about what does it even mean to explain something. Maybe you want to give that a read, and maybe that leads you into a productive direction as well. Problem with philosophy, of course, is it doesn't really give you answers. It gives you questions and things to think about, but it won't tell you what's right. Nevertheless, that would perhaps be my recommendation. Go to the very basics, sow a seed, and see whatever creative ideas and thoughts will grow from that. All right. Well, thank you very, very much for giving me this opportunity again. Thanks for coming. It was really nice to meet you.
And yes, thank you so much. I just want to say this was really wonderful, and I got so much out of this, and I'm sure the students did too. So yes, really, thank you so much for taking the time to share all your thoughts with us. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. And maybe I will see you again.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.